Welcome, everyone. We're about to start. We're just letting everyone in from the waiting room. Thank you for joining us for the next hour. My name is Kalina Elwand, and I'm the Communications Manager at the Global Center for Pluralism. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping remarks. So all audience members are muted to avoid background noise, and we invite you to keep your video on or off, depending on what you're comfortable with. We did opt for a meeting over a webinar as we're trying to recreate that feeling of being in a room together, something we certainly all miss. You'll also see polls popping up a couple times throughout the event, so feel free to participate in that if you're interested. If you are having trouble with your video, or if you're having trouble with your bandwidth, we recommend turning your video off. Shortly, this event will begin, and we will begin recording. Afterwards, we'll be posting an edit of the event on our website and social media, which we'll be sending out to all registrants. If you don't want your video to be visible in the recording, please turn off your video. We invite you to join the discussion in the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom middle of your screen. Please type your questions there at any time during the event, make them visible to everyone, and we'll address those as many as we can during the Q&A. If you experience any tech issues, please send a private message to the user titled IT support. I'm now pleased to introduce Meredith Preston-McGee, Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism. Over to you, Meredith.
Great. Thanks, Kalina. Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's such a sincere pleasure to see so many of you joining us today. I'm really pleased to welcome you to our discussion on Going Beyond Recovery, the Power of Pluralism in a Divided Age, presented by the Global Center for Pluralism in partnership with the International Crisis Group. The Global Center is headquartered in Ottawa at 330 Sussex Drive. So normally, if we were welcoming you all to our building, I would begin by acknowledging that our building sits on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. Unceded, meaning that the Algonquin Nation have not given us the rights to be on their land. We've continued with these acknowledgements even as our gatherings have become virtual. These land acknowledgements remind us of the ongoing processes of listening, of learning, and of action that are integral to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada and core to pluralism, and I believe an important reminder of some of the issues that we must remain focused on as we embark on our discussions for a post-pandemic future. As many of you, of course, are not in Ottawa, we also wanted to present today's panel in solidarity with all Indigenous peoples around the world, recognizing their ongoing struggles to see their rights and traditional lands recognized and protected. As you are all too well aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionately negative impact on vulnerable and marginalized groups around the world. Populations already in precarious situations before the pandemic, internally displaced persons, refugees, minority groups, women, youth have only seen circumstances worsen. While much work is focused on raising global awareness of these inequalities, we've convened today's dialogue to reflect on action. What are the practical actions and policy responses we can take to achieve more stable, just, and inclusive post-pandemic future? Founded by His Highness the Aga Khan and the Government of Canada, the Global Center's mission is to influence perspectives, inform policies, and inspire pathways to advance pluralism. So this year, Going Beyond Recovery is the central theme of our work. We believe that pluralism, an ethic of respect for diversity, has an important role to play in guiding societies towards a more inclusive recovery that addresses long-standing divisions and inequities. This effort needs to involve practitioners across political, economic, and sociocultural spheres. And today's panelists reflect the multidisciplinary approach and bring with them an incredible wealth of experience and insights for our conversation. We're particularly delighted that today's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Comfort Arrow, Interim Vice President and Africa Program Director at the International Crisis Group. As we move towards a post-pandemic future, how we reimagine conflict prevention as part of this conversation is absolutely critical, and we look forward to her insights on this important topic. I'm also honored to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Wendell Nilai Ejete, an award-winning historian, social entrepreneur, and humanitarian. Before joining the faculty at McGill University as Assistant Professor of US and African Diaspora History, he held the W.L. Mackenzie King Fellowship at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and Department of History Lectureship at Harvard University. Our second panelist is Ms. Kim Ghattas, an Emmy Award-winning journalist who covered the Middle East and US foreign policy for 20 years for the BBC and the Financial Times. She's also an esteemed member of our international jury for the Global Pluralism Award. Kim and Wendell, we're thrilled to have you with us today. If you can read their full bios in the chat, we're going to be posting those for you. Before I turn the conversation over to Comfort, we have a short video that introduces today's theme, which features contributions from our network of pluralism champions from around the world, reflecting on their priorities for going beyond recovery in their regions. Around the world, people are talking about recovery from the pandemic. But how do we push beyond recovery to repair major fault lines and build an equitable future for all? Here's what we're hearing.
In India,
in Nigeria,
in Brazil, we have been living in a dystopia.
In Southeast Asia, we must look out for the least visible who have shouldered the greatest burden of the pandemic.
The recovery must fight misinformation and the political gains that go along with it.
Are we ready to go beyond recovery in the US? I hope so. Yet in many ways, we're still very early on the pathway to pluralism.
In Kenya, the recovery needs to address the social and economic disparities of the population.
What we need now is what we needed before the pandemic: a proper welfare architecture, robust public health, and education.
The recovery must bring people together towards a shared vision of progress that emphasizes accountability, transparency, and service from leaders.
At first, we need new, far more inclusive processes for dialogue. Whose voice are we listening to? Who will benefit from this recovery and how?
It's now my great pleasure to hand the virtual floor, over to Comfort to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meredith, and it's a real pleasure to be in partnership with you today in such an important theme as we start thinking beyond the recovery. And it's also a pertinent time to be discussing it, given the various global conversations that are taking place about what that could potentially look like and how much we have learned from the past that will inform tomorrow as well. So it's a real pleasure to be part of that conversation with you and our two panelists as well. Just briefly, the International Crisis Group, for those of you who don't know the organization, is an independent organization working to prevent wars and shape policies that will build a more peaceful world. So it's even more pertinent to be part of this conversation with you, given our mandate. Crisis Group aspires to be the preeminent organization providing independent analysis and advice on how to prevent, resolve, and better manage deadly violent conflict across the world. A year ago, when the Director General for the WHO announced that this was now a global pandemic that we were facing, Crisis Group began examining the pandemic's long and short-term consequences for deadly violent conflict. Our COVID-19 and conflict 7 trends to watch provided a quick assessment of the potential for the pandemic to cause enormous damage in fragile states and trigger unrest. We assessed several things. First, that COVID's reach, its impact on global health, public health, the economic downturn it would precipitate, the social disruptions and the unrest it will leave in its wake. All of this would have and could shape conflicts and crises. A year ago, as we pondered the impact of COVID-19 on our work, especially conflict prevention and conflict management, we were concerned that the brunt of the pandemic will be felt especially amongst women, children, refugees, the internally displaced, and citizens of countries suffering from mismanagement, foreign sanctions, or both. We also thought that international conflict prevention and resolution mechanisms will suffer too. We also thought that governments may well have less time, less money and attention to devote to outside crises, feeling compelled to look inward and address their own nation's economic woes, at the expense of foreign assistance or diplomatic engagement. That travel restrictions too would impede diplomacy, mediation, peacekeeping, relief efforts, and more broadly, access to war zones. The pandemic also, we saw, could trigger great scapegoating as leaders look to detract the public or to blame others for problems to absolve themselves from culpability. Globally, the pandemic worsened already difficult relationships between the US and China and further dented multilateralism, but these trends were already on the rise regardless of the pandemic. Whether things will improve with a new US president is unclear. Thankfully, Joe Biden has signaled a return to international cooperation, bringing the United States back into key initiatives like climate change, also bringing support back to WHO as well. So while COVID has changed everything, so much has stayed the same. Amid the dramatic transformation that we're seeing that has resulted as a consequence of the pandemic, much remains unchanged in terms, for example, of international peacekeeping and peace and security. For example, major crises still loom. Warring factions did not take up the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. Some of them toyed with the idea, but they didn't go that way. Street protests may have lessened, giving strong leaders some respite and a chance to tighten their grip further. Three areas that appear to bear the hallmark of the pre-pandemic world are around inequalities, structural and political, protection and stability for the most vulnerable. Can we expect to see change in a post-pandemic climate? What of the area of social justice and accountability? Will the post-pandemic era pave the way for transformative and a more inclusive or more pluralistic societies and pluralistic agenda? Or is COVID set to cast a long shadow over the possibilities to reset our polity, to rebuild political, social, and economic structures that benefit all? I'm glad to be able to discuss these issues with Wendell and Kim, and look forward to hearing from the audience too about their reactions to these questions. Let me then turn the panel, my very first question to Wendell. I'm really glad to have you join us. And let me start by posing you the first question. As assistant professor for the US and Africa diaspora history at McGill University, you've long grappled with a number of these issues and subjects around, around social, structural racism, around inequality, around inclusivity. What do you see, Wendell, in your own work? What are the key political priorities in your country, in your region, in the areas that you focus on, that will help us address inequalities and secure protection and stability for the most vulnerable groups? What do you see as the biggest challenges to addressing these issues? What do you see as particular challenges that concern you most that may hinder progress in securing change or securing protection? And also, what do you see as a potential to mitigate these challenges? Over to you, Wendell. Thank you.
Thank you, Comfort, and thank you for the Global Center for Pluralism as well for this opportunity for convening us all to have this very important conversation. So I want to preface my remarks with a little bit of history and context. And history I find exceptionally humbling. So a century ago, almost exactly 100 years ago, the world was dealing with another pandemic, which was ravaging various communities in North America. Millions infected, millions died as a result of what was then sort of colloquially referred to as the Spanish flu. And in the midst of that pandemic, circa 1918, 1919, right? So this is right after the Great War, after countless millions of individuals had been wounded and killed as a result of the First World War. In the United States, there was a great deal of social anxiety, which was in fact predicated on sort of the racial divide, specifically the racial subordination and subjugation of African Americans, right? Descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. And in that particular moment, there were waves of what I would in fact described as ethnic cleansing or pogroms in various US cities. These were lynching campaigns, massive sort of racial terrorism campaigns inflicted upon Black men, women, and children, and entire Black communities. And it is difficult to disentangle sort of this wicked and barbarous forms of racial terrorism and the fact that people were also dealing, or governments were also trying to manage this pandemic, this sort of global pandemic as well, right? That was having an impact on the economy, on intergroup relations, et cetera, et cetera. And it's important to acknowledge that, and I'm going to circle back to that momentarily. But in our current moment, in our current economic downturn, the principal priorities, at least where North America is concerned, is that we need to get people vaccinated. The United States and Canada, for the most part, have the resources and access to acquire vaccines. They have the infrastructure in place to roll out widespread vaccinations of their populations. But we're also dealing with a lot of angst and anxieties around whether people should take the vaccinations or not. And that's not, that should not be sort of decoupled from past forms of public health injustice, where the state had behaved in a very egregious manner, again, dealing with regards to African Americans or Black people, with regards to Indigenous peoples, where the state did not exercise, I would say, integrity in its dealings of the most vulnerable populations, where public health and public medicines are concerned. And so there's the issue of vaccination so that we can open up our economies. And then, of course, there's this major issue of jumpstarting our moribund economies. And the pandemic has ravaged various sectors. We see that mom and pop operations and businesses are really underwater. It's mostly big box stores that can survive and have the infrastructure and capacity to forge ahead. And so getting people vaccinated, one, getting the economies back in full swing is another major objective. And clearly we have a long way to go in achieving that objective. But what is going to complicate this pursuit of sort of a post-pandemic world where we can enjoy a semblance of stability, a semblance of equality and equity, the main obstacle that I perceive, and the main obstacle that, again, sort of I alluded to a century ago, is this idea of polarization. And we should not underestimate just the power of polarization. And Comfrey certainly alluded to this, so did Meredith. But polarization is often and can often be sort of socially engineered. It can be manufactured. We're seeing various forms of polarization, various forms of misinformation, et cetera, et cetera. But the key objective with respect to polarization is what Stuart Hall, a great theorist, the late Stuart Hall, described as sort of a process of policing the crisis. So governments, institutions, even the media can help manufacture various polarizations and various forms of crises, which in turn the state can exercise dominion over those crises and try to police those crises. And as a result of that, because we live in a society here, especially in North America, that is highly stratified based on class, highly stratified based on race, it means that we have subordinate class groups and subordinate racial groups further becoming more antagonistic towards one another, right? And this is going to be a major source of contention. And I'll end really quickly on sort of an observation. We've heard much lately about various forms of anti-Asian bigotry and attacks and any form of discrimination towards any human beings, categorically wrong. But what history has taught us as well is that the state is very adept. The state is very adept at taking the attention off of the main issues, which is whether it could be mismanagement of resources, it could be sort of a lack of attention on pressing issues where vulnerable peoples are concerned. And all of a sudden, you find tensions out of nowhere between Asian peoples and African Americans, between X group and that group. We need to be very careful when that happens. This is what Stuart called a moral panic, right? To police the crisis. And so in the pursuit of correcting and addressing some of the major sort of fault lines that the pandemic has exposed, we have to address issues with respect to intergroup relations because we do live in a highly stratified world, highly stratified systems, and we must address the issues of subordination and elements of subjugation that will, of course, pit various groups against one another.
Wendell, thank you very much for that. And I confess I was nodding my head, but not visibly on the screen, because as you were speaking, especially your last point, I am speaking today from the UK. And last week, what some people, observers, would call a divisive report was issued that did not heal wounds and bring people together in terms of dealing with racial discrimination here in the UK, but may have further triggered, may have further polarized people's views, both within their various communities and across various social divides. So that sort of resonates right now as I'm moderating this from the UK. I mean, I can make references to other parts of the world, but it's this direct point speaks clearly to what is happening right here in the UK, and how certain, to use your phrase, how the government is both policing but is also judge and jury over some of these crises. Kim, can I pose the same questions to you that I asked Wendell, sort of what you see as the key political priorities from your locality today, and what you see as the biggest challenges, and particularly what may hinder progress towards change as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comfort, and it's really great to be part of this panel. Thank you to the Global Center for Pluralism for organizing and for asking me to be part of it. I'm picking up on something that Wendell just said about the state as it polices and dodges responsibility, and I want to hold on to that thought and come back to it in a moment as I talk about the Middle East. What strikes me about this conversation and about this moment that we're living through, that we've been living through for the last year, is that it is really a unique global moment. Not since World War II have we come together in a way as a world, as a globe, united by the same experience in a way. And it's really a moment to pause and think about our common humanity in fragility and in strength, in resilience and in ability to discover how we overlap in our inequalities within societies and between societies. In some ways, this has shown the fragility of countries or systems that thought they were beyond these concerns about health and pandemics. And so I do hope that as we understand that one person's vulnerability is everyone's vulnerability, from China to the US, from the US to the Middle East, from the Middle East to Africa, to India, etc., that this, I don't want to be naive, but that this will be a moment to pause and think about how we move forward together as a globe, as a humanity. And it is, encouraging, Comfort, to see that the Biden administration is thinking about how to lead, not just on diplomacy, but also on vaccines and global taxation and issues like that. When it comes to the Middle East, going back to the point that Wendell was making, here too, COVID has been, unfortunately, an opportunity for governments, militias, despots to increase their despotic authoritarian behavior and to excuse their abuses. And that takes me to the key problem that we have in this region. And, I'll reference one of the speakers in the video who said, what we need to do after the pandemic is what we needed to do before the pandemic. And she was talking about, welfare system, education, and so on. And what we need to do in the Middle East is address impunity and lack of governance. I do really feel that this is at the root of a lot of the issues in the region. Many, acute crises from Yemen to Syria to Egypt. As the Yemeni voice in the video said, there are so many crises. COVID is almost something we don't have the luxury to think about when you're in Syria or whether you're in Yemen. But even in Lebanon, where the economic collapse is so dire, that we don't have the luxury to accept a lockdown and not open our businesses or etc. because people are going to die of hunger because the state does not provide. And why does the state not provide is because there's been practically the wholesale robbing of a nation over decades, facilitated by lack of accountability, impunity, and lack of governance. Impunity, whether it's violence, whether it's economic, whether it's social, happens at various levels in this region. It can be state conducted, it can be militias, militant groups. It is, allies of the West, but also foes of the West. It is, a generalized state of affairs, I find, in this region. And very often, it is actually an issue that is aggravated by Western countries' support for some of these dictators, whether it's Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt or the royal family in Saudi Arabia, or even in a misguided effort to support pluralism and protect minorities. In Syria, for example, we saw a reluctance to push too much on President Assad as he tried to quell the uprising and the rebellion, because he was seen as the protector of Christians. But protecting one minority cannot come at the expense of everyone else. And here is where pluralism comes in, and where we have to really think about what we want from pluralism, and how it serves and how it can serve societies, and how it can be part of the conversation with rulers and actors in this region. Because pluralism, as the Center for Global Pluralism says on its website, pluralism is a positive response to diversity, right? Diversity is a fact, as is written, and how you respond to diversity is a choice. Well, a lot of the rulers in this country have chosen to respond to diversity with the usual divide to rule approach. And that's why we're seeing a lot of this continued behavior of these authoritarians who get away with it because their view is that it's us or chaos. We have to rule with an iron fist, otherwise, there will be sectarian warfare, when very often they're the ones who will provoke these sectarian violence. The biggest challenge, Comfort, I think, is this internal work that needs to be done locally, and that is being done, to build governance from the state, from the bottom up, and challenge the system with a new vision for politics. And I see that happening very much so amongst the young generation of protesters who are taking to the street again. The the class of 2019 protesters versus the class of 2011 protesters from the Arab uprisings. The class of 2019 has learned quite a bit. So they're trying to push back against the system. They are very diverse, pluralistic, and tolerant in their thinking. And it also requires pushing back against Western support for, rulers in this country at all cost, with the idea that these rulers provide stability when in fact they don't. And I'm not calling for regime change, but I'm calling for accountability. I'm calling for support that comes with strings attached and that recognizes that societies in this region are really pushing for pluralism, accountability, and governance.
Kim, that's excellent. And it's just precisely where we wanted to go, to get really sort of action-orientated responses in terms of how do we begin to develop sort of a reform agenda that will accompany us as we sort of come out of the pandemic. And a number of people, saying that, oh, as you were suggesting, that the pandemic will unite people, will show that we are all equally vulnerable, that we're both, when one person is vulnerable, all of us are vulnerable, but there's a sense in which certain things will remain the same. And as you started to explain what was happening in the Middle East, the one question I wanted to ask you, and I'd like to keep the microphone with you, as an eminent sort of, journalist, Emmy Award-winning journalist covering the Middle East and accountability, you've seen yourself the cost of conflict, the cost of war, and you've also seen, you refer to despotic leaders and how leaders have tended to misuse, and abuse these opportunities. So I wanted to ask you, what does, using the pluralism lens that you started to talk about, how does that inform, in practical ways, the steps that we can begin to take to sort of go beyond recovery? So it's not just about recovering from the pandemic, but it's also about recovering from years of accountability or impunity, years of social injustice, social inequalities, years of political marginalization, economic marginalization. So how can we begin to use pluralism as a tool to sort of deal with all these divisions that we're seeing, or is it a lost cause?
Oh, it's never a lost cause. Never, never. I grew up in Lebanon during 15 years of civil war, and you just cannot give up hope, because otherwise you might just as well, I don't know, die. But you don't, because you have to keep on living, and hope is what keeps you alive, and the hope that you can change things is what keeps us going, and is what gives us meaning, is what gives life meaning. It's not a lost cause, but it's not easy. And when you ask the question, what can we do? I think we have to define who the we is. Who is we? Are we talking about just the societies? Are we talking about Western governments? Are we talking about organizations like the Global Center for Pluralism? There are a lot of different actors, and they all have a different role to play. There is work to be done on the institutions in this region, on constitutions, on power sharing agreements, on acceptance of differences between communities, sects, differences between countries. I'm not a believer at all in the idea that the conflict in this region is sectarian, that it's Sunnis versus Shias, that it's always been like that and therefore will always be like that. Again, our diversity in this region is a blessing, but it has been used and abused by countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia and others to foment strife. I do think that there is a young generation that is hyper aware that this has been the case over the last few years. And I mentioned the class of 2019 of protesters from Sudan to Iraq, to Algeria, to Lebanon. Egypt is very difficult at the moment, but they are out there pushing. They're pushing for reforms. They're pushing for not non-sectarian societies, but post-sectarian societies, I would say. They relish the fact that one is Sunni and one is Shia and one is Druze and one is Kurdish, and they're all sitting together and they're forming new political parties that are not sectarian based, but that are multi-sectarian. And so in a way, I guess, post-sectarian, that are representative of the diversity of society, in the hope that they could reach the point where it's no longer an issue or no longer a question, whether you're Sunni or Shia or Christian, etc. I think building on the sense of community that is there and that was heightened, certainly in Lebanon, maybe because Lebanon is a small country, but I really felt that communities came together at the level of the neighborhood, of the village, of towns, of families. And that is very important. And community, people look out for each other. I don't know how Wendell felt in the US, but I was stuck in the US in March when the pandemic started, and I was desperate to come home because although I'd lived in the US for 10 years, I didn't feel that I had a strong sense of community there. Everyone kind of did their own thing. And I think over time, friends in the US as well rediscovered the importance of community, of neighbors, of making friends across fences. And that's something that we really need to foster. And that's something that really keeps us going in Lebanon through many, many difficult moments. And then, I think there needs to be a way to rewrite the social contract with the state. And that is something that Western countries must be involved in. Again, not in a sort of, in a diktat or in a regime change approach, but in a sort of, we're giving you support and we want certain things back. And you know why that's important is because it's not about imposing values. We want the same thing. And it is in the West's interest to see governance become the lay of the land, if you will. It is in the interest of the West to see governance and accountability take root in countries like ours in the region, because that ensures long-term stability. And finally, attached to that is credible elections to help a young generation that is really learning to do politics in a region where there's been dictatorships for 40 years and no one in their right mind would want to go into politics, to allow a new generation to run in free and fair elections. Because what I see around me is very encouraging. And I am hoping that over time, they will be able to push through and win seats in parliaments and rise through the echelons of power. I have great hope in the young generation of this region.
I mean, as you were saying that, Kim, one of the things that struck me is sort of a worry within an economic context is what the post-pandemic sort of climate is going to look like for those young people who are suffering, that they're the immediate sufferers in terms of loss of jobs, for example.
Absolutely.
So for example, from within the Africa continent, for example, a number of the young people are the innovators, they're the entrepreneurs, and yet they're the same ones who are suffering from a loss of job. And the longer we take to get out of the pandemic, the longer the grind is, the more difficult it is, the more frustrated they become against governments themselves that have tended to lock them out and misuse elections in certain instances to use them to block them out from these electoral processes. So it resonates what you're saying, and I'm trying to see how it plays out in other destinations and in other parts of the world. Wendell, I wanted to ask you the same sort of question, to ask you to think what do you see as sort of practical actions within a pluralism lens that will help to rebuild and deal with some of these inequalities that we're seeing today, and whether in a post-pandemic climate we can really begin to think about, practical avenues for dealing with these inequalities. And to remind our participants that as soon as Wendell has finished his intervention, we'll be really glad to hear sort of your comments, your observations and questions you may want to pose to the panel. Wendell, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Comfort. So before the pandemic, there was a phenomenon that we call post-industrialism. And post-industrialism effectively is sort of capital flight, right? The deindustrialization of urban places, whether in Canada and the United States, but in the United States, it's a major, major phenomenon, and it's been happening steadily, sort of in the post-World War II period. It certainly hastened, I would say, even in the 80s and into the 1990s, and the phenomenon of post-industrialism has ravaged cities across the United States. And it, of course, has amplified various issues around poverty, around violence, around sort of social decay, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of this post-industrialism, communities that were already ravaged and feeling sort of the brunt of this deindustrialization, principally African Americans, but you have Hispanics as well, and other minority groups and other working class white people who were also feeling the brunt. But there's a sort of a motley crew of working peoples who were feeling the brunt of post-industrialism, and then communities that still hadn't recovered from the housing crisis over a decade ago, and who effectively lost their only and meaningful asset. So as a result of this, we see during the pandemic right now that African Americans are disproportionately impacted as a result of COVID. Black men have exorbitantly high mortality rates as a result of COVID, followed by Black women and then other demographic groups. This is not by happenstance. There's a clear sort of antecedent in terms of how these inequities have been manifested, right? And I share that because in light of your question, Comfort, pluralism and sort of my own ethos and approach to pluralism is that pluralism is an instrument and attribute of justice. Pluralism is an instrument and attribute of justice. If we want a just world, without a doubt, we need systems of pluralism in place where various groups can have the dignity and the respect and the resources to thrive. But that also requires a concept called self-determination, right? Which is fundamentally our God-given right, our natural right to self-actualize, to pursue avenues that would make us whole as human beings. And if we want to go beyond the rhetoric of recovery, if we want to go beyond the rhetoric of normalcy, because normalcy might be hell for my neighbor, normalcy might be hell for my nieces and nephews who live in housing projects, right? Normalcy is not and should not be sort of the pole star, right? But if we truly want to go beyond this idea of recovery, then we must have some very courageous conversations around this idea of self-determination. And if we speak of self-determination in the North American context, where I'm situated and work, and also on the African continent, where I'm also situated and do work, we need to speak to issues around various forms of colonialism and neocolonialism, right? We need to speak to issues around debt traps. We need to speak to issues around land and sovereignty. We have to address issues around reparative justice, okay? And even just this issue of reparative justice, this issue of reparations is something that African-American communities in the United States have spoken about and have demanded for over a century, since the end of the Civil War, right? But now we see sort of a growing chorus, sort of a groundswell for notions of reparative justice, because the most vulnerable communities realize that there's absolutely no way that they can even live and subsist without sort of redressing historical harms. And in order to move beyond recovery, we must find a way to have not only the conversations, but the political courage to enact forms of redress and reparative justice in the North American context. In the African context, we have to be very, very courageous to address issues around neocolonialism. Because there was so much hope, of course, in the mid 20th century of decolonization and the independence movement in Africa, and Asia, in the Middle East, in the Caribbean, throughout the Americas. But what happened effectively was that you had puppet regimes. They might look phenotypically and corporeally like those whom they lord power over, but their interests align with the interests of Washington, the interests of Brussels, the interests of London, the interests of Paris, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we truly want systems that are just, systems that are pluralistic, various sort of ethno-racial, religious, linguistic groups that can thrive and subsist peacefully, peaceful coexistence, we're going to have to address issues around sort of gross forms of land theft that are still present on the African continent today, that have requisitioned indigenous lands from indigenous African peoples. We'll have to address that. We'll have to address issues of corporate kleptocracy and forms of plunder and the ravaging of African resources. We will absolutely have to deal with that. We will have to address certainly issues around just what sovereignty means and what self-determination means. Without these conversations and without sort of actionable steps, we're literally just marching towards a precipice, and it's not going to be pretty. For the longest time, the West and principally Western Europe could use Gaddafi as a gatekeeper of sorts to stifle the flow of would-be migrants who would literally give up their limbs, they would give up their freedom, they would endure bondage, whatever it took, so long as they could maybe make it to the shores of Southern Europe. Now that gatekeeper is no longer there, right? And so with a destabilized Africa, with various forms of sort of conflicts on the continent, and just the gross inequality on the continent, and the sheer vulnerability, and you have this massive, massive, massive sort of youth bulge on the continent. If we don't address these issues of inequality, Western Europeans who have known a comfort of stability, a comfort of sort of high standard of living, imagine what will happen if tens of millions of displaced peoples are seeking refuge elsewhere. And North America has an Atlantic Ocean. But even then, that's not a stopgap per se. And so we have to have some very genuine conversations around what it means for Western Europeans and other powers around the world to stop plundering the African continent, stop plundering the indigenous Black peoples of the African continent, and what redress looks like.
Thanks, Wendell. And there's a lot in there. And I think, Meredith, that deserves a sort of separate conversation on itself, not only the migration northwards, but also the migration within the continent. And we also have it in a number of statistics shows just how much of those migrants actually flow back into the continent and stay onto the continent, and how the regions themselves are the ones that are the ones who are the safe havens for a number of these migrants. I have a lot of questions that are coming through, both for Wendell and Kim, and we've got some questions around leadership as well. But Kim, you started to sort of expose or show the possibilities of what new leadership would look like, and a number of people, a number of commentators quite liked and would like to know more about the class of 2012, 2011 versus the class of 2019. And I appreciated the way in which you sort of categorized both groups, because I certainly saw how the class of 2019 learned a lot from the class of 2013 in Sudan, so to speak, to use a Sudanese example. But one first question to both of you from Aisha Robinson, to you and Wendell. I love I'd love for Wendell and other panelists to speak more to the moral panic and the way that media shifts the narrative. I agree that any discrimination, hate, oppression is wrong, no matter who it is directed at. However, I also believe by aiding communities that the most disenfranchised or oppressed, such as Afro-Indigenous and other Indigenous communities across the world, it will help to raise all communities out of oppression. When we start focusing solely on smaller groups, the positive policy changes or social reform is only really felt without silos. So I think that's more of an observation to the issues that both you and Wendell have raised, Kim. A specific question to you, however, Wendell, from Dr. Daniel Otieno, what do you see as the key drivers of emergent polarization in Europe and the US? And a question from a member of parliament, from Yasmin Ratsani, what are some concrete steps individuals can take to help organizations like the Global Center for Pluralism engage the world in pluralism and reduce polarization? And actually, Meredith, I might ask you to answer that question when you give your reflections at the end. But Wendell and Kim, do you want to sort of reflect and provide your own responses to those? And because I'm looking at the time and noticing that we've got thousands of questions, but we can't sort of take them all in. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll address Mr. Otieno's question very quickly regarding sort of forms of inequality in Europe and in North America. So it's super important to keep in mind that the modern world order, at least in the Western context, is predicated on stratification, right? Stratification based on race, stratification based on religion, on class, et cetera, et cetera. In the United States specifically, and going back several centuries, right, stratification was literally part and parcel of sort of the sinews, the fabric, just the fibers of the nation itself. So much so that the founding settler colonizers of the United States predicated liberty and freedom on white skin, on sort of a European-ness. So liberty and freedom was predicated on European-ness, and bondage and subordination and subjugation was predicated on African-ness, meaning Blackness. This is literally the sort of the established order of the society, that to be free meant you have to be white phenotypically and by ancestry. And to be not free, you had to be Black and African. Right. These structures are still very much part of what the United States is today. And so you have white people at the top, you have Black people at the bottom, and you have various groups along sort of this ladder that are always jockeying for position. So when I alluded to the moral panic around Asian Americans and African Americans and conflict therein, that is a process of, again, taking attention away from the fact that the structure and the system and its antecedents have been rotten from the beginning. And whenever there are issues, the best way to diffuse the issue, at least from perspective of the state and the perspective of institutions such as the media, is to expose sort of problems in subordinate group relations.
Thanks, Wendell. Kim, you can reflect also on that question, but I wanted to ask you a specific question because you raised it. And I think one of our questioners really wanted to tease this some more from you. How can youth living in diverse communities and countries with different cultures, traditions, and norms be encouraged to view pluralism as a strength? So I'd like you to sort of explore further some of the themes that you were raising within the context of the Middle East and specifically Lebanon as well.
I'll say that there was a time when the Middle East did embrace its diversity and pluralism and was a much more tolerant region. It was much more pluralistic and diverse and tolerant than Europe. Travelers from Europe in the 18th and 19th century to this region were, stunned that Christians and Jews and Muslims lived together the way they did, in a way that was much more tolerant than was possible in Europe at the time. And with colonialism, to pick up on some of the themes discussed by Wendell, some of these pluralistic approaches to life and to diversity, whether religious or ethnic, were used by colonial powers to rule and divide as well. Now, I'm very much one to want to focus on the power within us to change these narratives and these antecedents. So I look at the period from the 40s onwards up until 1979, when colonialism ended, and before the key year of 1979 that I'll mention in a second, where the region was able to move on to some extent from colonialism and try to undo some of the damage. It was still very diverse, very much embracing its diversity. The creation of the State of Israel shattered some of those relationships between Christian and Jews, between Muslims and Jews, and it became worse over time. And then with 1979, and during that period, of course, you also had the rise of nationalism, which drove some of the diverse communities out of countries like Egypt. But 1979 for me is really the breaking point, when the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran starts, and two countries that is one dominantly Shia, one dominantly Sunni, which were allies before, become mortal enemies, and they start using sectarian identities to pit people against each other and to rally people to their side. And they do that by also using religion, and that impacts culture, and intolerance starts to rise, not just religious, but also cultural. And 40 years later, we're dealing with a lot of darkness. I think that to move forward, we don't have to, reinvent the wheel. We can just look at our own history. And within our own history are the seeds of pluralism, are the seeds of diversity and tolerance that are still there, actually, when I look around me. It's just that it doesn't make the headlines. But it is there, and we can go back to it. And I see a young generation seizing those seeds of tolerance and diversity to try to build a better future.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And that's a really positive way in which to end. Meredith, in 30 seconds, one concrete step individuals can take to help the work that you're doing at the Center to promote pluralism.
Right, in 30 seconds. Thanks, Comfort. I know we could keep talking for ages. Just a couple of things. I mean, I think the first thing is it's become visible. It has to stay visible, and it has to stay visible in all decisions all the time. These conversations are uncomfortable, and we have to keep having the uncomfortable conversations and then take different actions as a result. And I think, Kim, to your point on Generation 2019, that the youth in Myanmar on the streets have been on my mind every day. And we say amazing what they're doing. How do we support it? How do we actually do something as outsiders to respect their own agency in their own country, but to do something respectful to help? And that's where we have this sort of cognitive dissonance right now. So there are actions we can take. So Comfort, I would say, maybe as my last point, someone in the chat said that we should have sort of a platform to continue this discussion. And this is definitely only the beginning. You'll notice in the video, we mentioned that we're going to have a space on the website to continue this. We want to add some of the questions and great comments from this session there. We'll be posting the session online, and I hope we can continue this discussion on the website and in other sessions like this going forward.
Good. Thank you very much, Meredith. Thank you very much, Kim. Wendell, I've certainly taken a number of points away from this, and it's true, Meredith, we have to continue the conversation. My big headlines, and I really appreciate certain sharp phrases from you and Wendell Kim. Pluralism is an instrument, an attribute of justice. I think that itself is something that we should remember, and digging down into our history to be more humbler, but to use history to inform what the future looks like, because some of those key values are already inherent in our societies. And I appreciate the way Wendell and Kim made that. Thank you very much to our participants. Thank you very much to our audience. Thousands of questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all your questions, but the Center is collecting them because I think they will form the basis of continued conversations. That's it for me. It's been a pleasure moderating this session today, and I wish you all safe journeys wherever you are, and stay well. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Comfort.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Bye. Thank you.